Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Vincent Campbell, and this week we're going to be talking about theories of media and society. Now, if we're thinking about theory, it's important for those of you who haven't studied social science theory before, or perhaps it's been a while since you looked at theory. I've suggested some preparatory reading that you might want to do before you continue with this presentation, before you do the key reading. These are both quite short chapters. And there are things on your reading list, and they just introduce the idea of theory and theory in the media context. So this week is concerned with some foundational theories of the relationship between the media and society. And of course there are lots and lots of theories out there, and we've got 1 week, and some of the other theories that are linked to these ideas you'll be exploring across the rest of the module as well. Now, one of the things that you should think about straight away is, and many of you may have professional backgrounds in the media, is that media industry research is typically what we call administrative and atheoretical. In other words, it's things like Nielsen or Ofcom in the UK monitoring television viewing figures, looking at breakdowns of television ratings, how many people own mobile phones. And mostly it's just about tracking industry trends, industry patterns amongst audiences, normally amongst audiences and industry figures. And there's not really anything theoretical about it, in the sense that they're not trying to make sense of why things are going on particularly, other than in terms of the bottom line of companies, the performance of public service broadcasters, that kind of thing. Academic research, on the other hand, is typically critical and theoretical. In other words, it's trying to understand why things are happening the way they're happening. So if we compare administrative research on television audiences, for instance, to academic research on audiences, it might be on things like, why do people watch what they watch? Why are certain programs constantly topping the ratings? And also things like, what are the consequences for society? It might be that it's great that loads of people are watching the X Factor or Dancing with the Stars, programs like that, but what are the consequences of those kinds of programs? So the relationship between theories of the media and theories of society, sort of social theories, social sociology theory, have actually a very long history. The development of liberal democracy has often been tied by political scientists and social scientists as being directly tied to the media. What we sometimes call the dominant paradigm links the media directly to the creation and maintenance of liberal democracy. Mainly what you'll see in the literature is references to press freedom, because a lot of these ideas emerged in the 19th century, and of course the main mass medium then was newspapers. And we see them referred to in the French Revolution, the US War of Independence, through the 19th century in Britain and other European countries, and so on. And actually you see it in philosophical literature as well. People like Milton, through to John Stuart Mill, a whole variety of writers talk about the sort of fundamental relationship between the idea of liberal democracy, free speech, free association, choice and so on, and the role that the press play within that. Now, many prominent theories of the media stem from critiques of this dominant paradigm. You can read more about the liberal theory of press freedom in the literature on your reading list, and it will crop up again and again throughout the whole course, in fact, as the dominant paradigm against which media industries are judged. But of the critical theories and ideas that I want to talk about today, I'm going to concentrate on one particular one, which is the idea of the mass society. This has quite a long historical root, that's one reason for mentioning it, but it also illustrates how sometimes academic theory sort of feeds into wider popular culture, public debates about these kinds of issues. Now, the idea of a mass society emerged in the late 19th century and was particularly dominant in the first half of the 20th century. Now, one of the reasons I've mentioned it is because it's particularly important because it emerged around the same time that the dominant media industries started to appear, and also a lot of the media professions. So it was around the time of the rise of film, of radio, later television, but also of the industries of advertising, marketing and public relations. So we're talking the 1910s and 1920s, 1930s. And of course, at that same time, there were rapid social changes going on, not just things like world wars, but massive global industrialisation and the social changes associated with that. Now, some scholars early on in the late 19th century, very early 20th century, kind of saw these changes and the rise of the mass society as a risk to elites, really, the capability of elites to manage and control society in the interests of others. And you can see links between these concerns and the rise of mass universal suffrage. So as more and more people became eligible to vote in lots of countries, increasing concerns from those who were gradually losing power as a result of universal suffrage. But later on, and by the time we're really interested in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, the mass society idea was seen as a risk to democracy itself by perceiving the mass public, the mass of ordinary people, as an irrational mob. And this was actually very heavily influenced by the ideas of Sigmund Freud, who saw that the atrocities committed during World War I, the Soviet Revolution, Russian Revolution in 1917, and widespread problems with the Great Depression in the 1920s in the US and elsewhere, was linked to the idea of irrational mobs and humans, the growth of psychology. Now, one of the reasons it's a useful theory, even though it's quite an old one now to talk about, is because, as I said, it links in very carefully and closely with sort of wider public attitudes at the time. So this idea of massification, the rise of mass industry, of mass production, and of course mass media, weren't just academic. They were heavily influenced by and influencing on wider popular culture and literature at the time. And one of the sort of typifying characteristics of this early part of the 20th century in the rise of the mass society was the idea of alienation and isolation. That individual citizens were increasingly disconnected from the processes and structures of society as it became ever bigger, ever larger, ever more complicated. And you can see that in things like the writing of Franz Kafka, the art of Edvard Munch, famously painted The Screen, and in films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And the image is taken from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which is a very good illustration of these kinds of debates. And concerns over the power of the media, specifically within the mass society, were related to a number of things that happened in this period as well. World War propaganda, both in World War I and World War II, that was seen to be potentially very powerful and effective over audiences, mobilising people to commit atrocities, to participate in wars and so on. But you also have things like Edward Bernays' PR campaign, Torches of Freedom, which you may have heard of. This is a campaign in the 1920s where at that time in America there was a kind of social taboo that women didn't smoke. And he arranged an event where at a sort of typical public event that would guarantee media coverage, he paid a whole number of debutantes to suddenly all light up their cigarettes, and there became this idea of torches of freedom that associated the product of smoking with female emancipation, and sales of cigarettes increased in the US, and it's often cited as a classic example of the power of PR. And of course, with hindsight, whether they knew it at the time or not, but now we know smoking is a very dangerous thing, so it's seen as this potential corrosive influence. The other example you'll see cited in some of the literature is Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, an infamous radio broadcast in 1938, where a lot of people tuning in late thought it was an actual news broadcast suggesting the Martians were invading America, leading to some famous research on that. So these kinds of events have become signifiers of the idea and risks of the mass society. So here's one author summing up the particular ideas. Thompson says, mass society theorists saw industrialisation, urbanisation, bureaucratisation, and the sheer scale of modern society as destroying the strong group ties of church, clan, guild and local neighbourhood that had previously brought order to society and meaningful participation for individuals. The absence of such ties was viewed as leaving individuals alienated and vulnerable to manipulation by elites, demagogues or extremist social movements. It was a logical extension of this idea to see the mass media as a tool for the manipulation of the masses. So here we see a very sort of common idea in a lot of early theories, critical theories of the media in society, suggesting the media had a great deal of power and influence and potentially negative influence on society. Now, one particularly important version of the mass society theory is C. Wright Mills. And what I've done is tabulate a couple of the key ideas that he talked about. You'll also find these in Mills and Barlow's chapter, which is the key reading, which I'll come back to in a moment. What C. Wright Mills suggested was that you could distinguish between human beings, citizens in a society, as having formerly been in part of a public, a communicative public in pre-mass society, and the mass in the mass society. And the table sort of illustrates the differences. In a public, virtually as many people express opinions as receive them. Public communication allows for immediate and effective answering of any opinion expressed. Opinion formed by such discussion readily finds an outlet in effective action, and the public is more or less autonomous in its operations. The kind of classical example of this is the ancient Athenian agora. So the idea in ancient Athens, sort of 300 BC, something like that, is of all the citizens meeting in the same space and debating, for instance, whether they should go to war or not. And then, of course, if they all agree, then off they go to war. And of course, in a mass society of millions of people, you can't have everybody meeting together and discussing it openly amongst themselves. So in a mass society, far fewer people express opinions than receive them. Again, in a traditional media sense here, we're talking about where these ideas originated from, newspapers, film, television, radio. You're talking about largely passive media, broadcast to millions, but not much opportunity for people to respond back. One could critique that today with new media, interactivity, and those things we'll pick up later in the module and later in the degree. Secondly, communications make it difficult or impossible for the individual to answer back immediately or effectively. So again, this idea of the problem of information going more one way, out to people rather than back from people. The realisation of opinion in action is controlled by authorities who control the channels of such action. In other words, if you think about social processes for enacting protests, say about your job or your workplace, the government changes the laws about how you're taxed or something, you can vote to change that government, you can engage in certain kinds of protests, strike action and so on, but increasingly these things are bound by rules and regulations. It's not a free-for-all where you can just do what you want to do. And lastly, the mass has no autonomy from institutions, a particularly sort of negative view of the idea of the mass public being powerless in the face of powerful institutions. Now within Wright Mills' model, the media play a particularly important role, and it's useful as an example theory because it gives the media a huge amount of power. We see the key ideas that Mills says about the role of the media. He argues that the media define our understanding of reality. For most of our experiences of anything beyond our immediate lived experiences, anything going on the other side of the world, for instance, it comes from the media. Secondly, the lack of real difference in media content limits our ability to be critical of media content. Again, in an environment where, for instance, in the 1930s, you only had the BBC as a radio broadcaster and later television broadcaster. It's that one platform, a small number of newspapers, small number of newsreels. Again, we're talking about a traditional media era here where there were few outlets that dominated. The media define our sense both of who we are and also who we want to be. So this idea of aspiration and, of course, promotional industries like marketing, advertising, PR, build up products and processes as certain ways we should behave. But also this idea of identity. Some scholars, Marshall McLuhan famously thought that the idea of national identity and the nation state was heavily linked to traditional mass media because they provided a common platform for the same messages, the same ideas. And lastly, the idea that the media obscures our chances of understanding our social reality and do not connect individuals to larger events, except in a kind of passive sense of sitting in your home, listening to things on the radio, watching them on television. Pretty strident ideas, and you'll find variations on this in a number of different ways in the wider reading. So, critiquing mass society theory. What can we say? Well, something that we want you to think about in discussions online and in your own activities and reading, thinking about the reading. Some key criticisms. First of all, what do we mean by mass here? Perceptions of the mass, particularly of the mass public, as a vulnerable mob who can be manipulated by the powerful. Is that really accurate? Is that the best way to describe the majority of population? Is a mob a particularly pejorative way of looking at people? Secondly, presumptions of negative societal consequences of the mass media. So these elite critiques are sort of said, well, what happens is mass media out there, they push out these messages and everyone just believes it and then they comply with what's going on. Is that really the way things go on? And even if it was, is it necessarily negative? Some would argue, Edward Bernays for one, that this was a useful resource for maintaining peaceful and compliant populations in democratic society. And lastly, we can also talk about criticisms of mass cultural output. A lot of this literature talks about mass media products like films, radio programs, as though they're not as worthy as pieces of fine art or theatre and so on. And that's another critique which has developed a lot over time. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of the kinds of debates around one theory of media in society. The next steps are to go to the key readings. The first of which is actually a piece from C. Wright Mills in Barlow and Mills's book. You'll see in that section other chapters on other kinds of similar critiques and theories, but we picked out chapter 9 for you to read. And then after that, you can look at chapter 11 of Long and Wall's Media Studies, Text, Production and Context, which uses the mass society as a starting point, but then draws on a range of other theories as well into that critique.